right, next up is our coveted keynote speaker, Katie Picchione. Katie is with the she's a response coordination lead at the NASA Disasters Response Coordination System. As the response coordination lead for NASA's Disaster Response Coordination System, or DRCS, Katie works with the DRCS team, subject matter experts across the agency, and stakeholders in the emergency management community to develop Earth observation data products that fill information gaps during disasters. Before coming to NASA, Katie held a research position with the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Systems group at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, focusing on applications of remote sensing in disaster response and recovery. Leveraging skills in systems analysis and socio-technical systems engineering, she also supported programs related to food aid delivery, supply chain management, conflict prevention, and other humanitarian missions. Katie previously worked at FEMA, where she helped identify new uses of aerial imagery in emergency management and served as a crowdsourcing unit leader in the National Response Coordination Center. So with that, thank you, Katie, for being here.
Is this mic on? Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And Carla and Eddie, I am so grateful and so honored to be invited to speak to all of you today. I'm the response coordination lead for the NASA Disasters Response Coordination System, which is part of the NASA Disasters Program. Actually, at Zan's suggestion, I titled this talk, Expanding on the What, So What, and Now What? Applications of Earth observation data. And just to get a sense, how many people here work in emergency management? Okay, great. And how many people here work with satellite data specifically? A lot, okay. So for those who might not be familiar, emergency managers talk about the what, so what, and now what as part of the information collection and decision-making process. They want to know what happened, so what were the implications of those impacts, and now what? What are we going to do about it? And this is a framework that we find to be really useful when thinking about how to apply Earth observation data in disasters and to make those data not just interesting, but impactful. So I wanted to start, this is a picture of the joint field office in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. When significant disasters happen, FEMA works with the state and local jurisdictions to set up these offices in the field where coordination happens across a large number of stakeholders. And I wanted to start with a story. When I was with FEMA, I did visit the Joint Field Office in Puerto Rico once, but actually my first deployment with FEMA was for Hurricane Florence, which made landfall in North Carolina and caused extensive flooding there in 2018. And I'd been with FEMA for about a month, and then Florence happened, and they said, okay, you go down and support recovery. And at the time, I was pretty new to emergency management and was working with organizations that were doing aerial collection missions. So I was working in Imagery. And as some of you might remember, shortly after Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Michael made landfall and impacted many of the same areas. We had someone on staff at the field office in North Carolina who had a house in Panama Beach. And right after Michael happened, he came up to me pretty much every day for a week or two because he just wanted to know if his house was still standing. And so for disaster survivors, that's the real impact that overhead imagery and satellite imagery can have, is knowing, do I have a house to go back to? What is the recovery going to look like for me? We saw this again most recently, with every disaster, but our team in particular saw this after the fires in Los Angeles a few months ago. The Jet Propulsion Lab, the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab is in Pasadena. The whole lab was evacuated. Several of my colleagues lost their homes. And people who work in Earth observation data, we're posting things on LinkedIn you might have seen, and just wanted to know why is it that we have all of these satellites and all of these assets and all of these capabilities, but the people who are most impacted by disasters and the people who are making decisions to direct response and recovery don't always have access to these resources. This is the $1 billion disaster data that NOAA publishes every year, or quarterly actually. The point here is that between the time FEMA was created and DHS was formed, we were experiencing about $4 billion disasters a year. Now we're experiencing about 2 per month. So just to emphasize, and there have been policy changes and other changes in expectations of the role the federal government should play, changes in economic activity and where we're building. But the point is that obviously disasters are continuing to become more severe, and the tools and technologies and processes that have been developed to address disasters, kind of up until this point, really were developed, a lot of those policies and processes were developed in a world that no longer exists. And so technologies like remote sensing, like satellite imagery, can really empower emergency managers to do more, and to do more with what they have. So these are some of the kinds of activities emergency managers do that are areas where remote sensing can provide actionable information, decisions about making evacuations, providing food, water, and shelter as the Red Cross does, directing search and rescue operations, and then more on the recovery side, understanding the impacts to infrastructure and homes, debris removal operations. These are all the kinds of places where emergency managers are using geospatial data, and remote sensing can be an amplifier for those efforts. And so what I wanted to kind of, I guess this is the takeaway, right? Is that my vision, our vision within the NASA Disasters Program, and I think within the community at large who works in applications and GIS in emergency management, I think one of my vision is that overhead imagery would be available to provide essential information to responders and survivors for every disaster. And so the call to action here is that those of you who work in Earth observation data, work in areas adjacent to or kind of touching on emergency management, hopefully you take something away from my talk, from the wonderful talks we just heard, and all of the talks today and conversations today, to help work towards this. So, and I also want to emphasize the every disaster part. I think we see a lot of action to collect aerial imagery, apply satellite imagery in incidents like Helene, Milton, the LA fires, these truly catastrophic incidents that have wide-ranging impact. We don't see as much use of satellite imagery or aerial imagery or anything at all often for the long duration, slow, prolonged flooding events. There's much less activity around. There was pretty severe flooding in Kentucky back in February, and end of February, beginning of March. There were these tornado outbreaks across the country. These kinds of disasters that have, and sometimes just as much impact over a wide area, but maybe aren't as exigent, aren't demanding as much attention from the national news. Those are the places where satellite imagery, I think, really can shine, especially low resolution, low latency imagery from satellites like the GOES system and other things like that. So anyway, we'll talk more about that. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the NASA Disasters Program. So the Disasters Program has been around for about 10 years. We live within the Applied Sciences program of the Earth Sciences Division. So NASA does space technology, NASA does earth science, and we have 3 core program elements. We have a science portfolio where we invest in research to leverage Earth observation data for disaster applications broadly. We have a portal, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And actually, I think one of our portal team is here today. So if you have questions about how to access our data, they're the people to talk to. But we're calling it the Disasters Partnership and Learning Platform. And then we have this disaster response coordination system element. And that's what I'm part of. That's my team. And so the mission of the DRCS, for the first, DRCS just launched this past summer, so we're a new element of the program. And for the first many years of the disasters program, we had sort of an ad hoc posture in supporting organizations like FEMA and state emergency management agencies. DRCS was established to systematize the way we provide support to response agencies with Earth observation data. So, when a disaster happens, FEMA or a state emergency management agency or a nonprofit can reach out to us and say, hey, is there, can NASA help provide data to shed light on flooding or landslides or fire burned area perimeters to support our response? And when that's the case, we receive that request. We work with our network of NASA centers. NASA has, I think, 10 centers, and 6 of them are part of the disasters program. We have coordinators at each center who respectively build relationships with the scientists and subject matter experts at each of those centers, so that when a disaster happens, we can reach out across the agency and leverage the science that's going on across the whole agency for any given response. So these are examples of some of the products that we develop frequently or have developed, in the past year. We do things like assessing power outages using nighttime lights data, detecting flooding or the extents of other hazards with optical and synthetic aperture radar data. We've got a couple different landslide analyses that we are doing and are prototyping. A lot of the work that we're able to tap into is experimental. And so, we're not, I would say, people often ask, how is NASA different from NOAA? And well, NOAA produces authoritative data products. We have all of these great scientists and engineers at our disposal who are doing new things every day and always doing new research. And so we can publish data that, might be sooner, but maybe have less confidence. And so, anyway, we produce a lot of experimental data products as well. Last year, we responded to 24 disasters spanning 14 states, 7 countries, 7 hazard types, and 21 unique requesters. I'll talk about that. Yeah, so we are, this year we've already had, I think we just wrapped up our 4th activation with at least 3 different hazard types, although I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head. So we're growing as a program. Last year, 24, that was more activations than we've had in any year prior. So just to give you a sense of how kind of the scope of the program. When we activate, we have a fairly structured activation process. We're kind of constantly monitoring so that our team is aware of hazards that are incipient or approaching or just happened and whatnot. So we're constantly monitoring. But we, hold on, sorry. Okay, but we actually start our activation process when we receive a request. And so like I said, federal, state, county level organizations as well, nonprofits can reach out to us and say, hey, can NASA support this incident? And when that happens, we have a screening process where we evaluate whether we have the people, the resources, the tools to actually answer questions. We do an activation, we publish data on our portal, we deactivate and have an after-action assessment process. But a lot of times the requests that we get look like this. People reach out, they don't know what NASA's capable of, because there's a pretty big gap between emergency managers and the experience and expertise emergency managers have and the vast world of remote sensing science. And so often requests look like this. People say, give us everything you've got. Like, what can NASA do for us? And this might be, give us everything you've got that shows damage or that provides essential information that we can add to our dashboard, that answers questions that we don't know what those questions are yet. And so part of our job is to also kind of figure out what is the question that's actually being asked. And we have, over the last few months, we've been putting a lot of effort into trying to document what are the capabilities, we were talking about capabilities earlier, that NASA has that are regularly used or asked for or applicable, and how do we work with our stakeholders to empower them to basically ask better questions and tell us, be more specific about what they need as well. How do we bridge that communication gap between the technical and the policy process communities of practice? So, when I started working in this domain, I think I had a lot of misconceptions about satellite data, and these are common to many of our stakeholders in emergency management. We're all used to having Google Earth at our fingertips or Google Maps at our fingertips now. And so we have a common literacy around the use of satellite imagery and what it looks like to have a satellite imagery, at your fingertips. And so I think that we think that satellites are always up there, 24/7. So why don't we have imagery right away during disasters? And satellite imagery looks like Google Earth, right? Isn't it just optical? But we also have, of course, synthetic aperture radar and other kinds of imaging assets that produce data that doesn't maybe look like what you're used to looking at. So, and then of course, satellites they're way up in space. They have a huge field of view, right? Can't they see the whole impacted area? But of course, the trade-offs between resolution and area coverage mean that, sure, you might be able to see the whole world, but only at a meter. And if you want 25 centimeter resolution imagery, you're probably looking at a much smaller space. So we have to kind of keep all of these realities in mind as we're responding to these requests, as well. So this is I love this graphic. This is NASA's Earth fleet. We have a number, we have basically a whole lot of satellites in space. Many of them are designed for science missions. Part of our job is to figure out which of them can provide useful information in emergency management at all. So we've got some circles here around assets that we use regularly. MODIS, VIIRS, we're using the GOES satellites, like I mentioned. Which other ones? Oh, Tempo is a new satellite that just launched that provides air quality data. So that one's new over the last year. We're kind of figuring out how to use that better. We're anxiously awaiting the launch of NISAR, which will provide, I think, 3 to 10 meter SAR, L and S-band SAR imagery globally every 12 days, and 6 days at the poles. Anyway, so we've got a lot of capabilities. One of the things that's really awesome is that we have all of these different assets that we can leverage to do all sorts of cool science, to answer lots and lots of different questions. And that's wonderful, but it also makes it really hard to tell people what is the list of things that we actually can do. So and just to provide a little bit more context around why this is challenging to have just like a list, is because not only do you have all of these assets in space, but for assets that need to be tasked, we also do have access to some commercial data through the Commercial Smallsat Data Acquisitions Program. But for any asset, right, there's this tasking, collection, processing, analysis, and dissemination workflow that needs to happen. Each of those steps has different technology that's involved in it. If you have technical issues with any of those systems, that can lead to a delay, or just your data doesn't get delivered at all. Similarly, there are a whole host of environmental contingencies ranging from the cost of operating systems or personnel being out on leave to geomagnetic storms. During Helene, actually, there were geomagnetic storms that took place during Hurricane Helene, and I know one of our partners in the commercial sector had to put their satellites in safe mode for a day or two to prevent damage to those valuable systems. And so, it seemed like a bad inject into an exercise, but these things really happen, right? So environmental factors can influence the ability to deliver or produce any given data product. And then, of course, there's the fact that each of these systems, each of these pieces of the process is done by somebody different. And so when I think about remote sensing in disaster response as a complex socio-technical system, I think that one of the hardest pieces is coordinating among all of these different experts who may or may not know each other, may or may not have worked together before, may or may not have an understanding of those user needs and the decisions that they're making at the end of the day. And so I think over the last 5-10 years, there has been a lot of effort to improve coordination among the people who work in GIS and remote sensing and emergency management, and that has led to a great increase in our ability to collectively, utilize imagery effectively. So we're working on a draft menu. I'm going to share a little bit about how we're taking all of these contingencies into effect to try to communicate more clearly what are the things that you can do, that NASA can do with Earth observation data, but also what are the things that you can do with Earth observation data? Because all of our data is free and openly available, as we just heard as well, right? The EO API might be a way to access some of this data going forward. So going back to this, what, so what, now what framework, I find to be a really helpful way to try to start bucketing and thinking about Earth observation data. So you might have just plain imagery, and imagery is really valuable for situational awareness. I think of this as, your RGB image, maybe it's SAR that's processed to be an RGB image, maybe it's false color, shortwave infrared imagery, maybe it's panchromatic, but anything that's kind of an RGB or single band image where the primary use would be to look at it and for somebody to look with their eyes and think with their brain and see what they're seeing. And it's this situational awareness piece that imagery fills. And so it's those questions that emergency managers don't know that they have at the outset. And then there's the what happened. We think of this as the boundaries of an incident, vector data and raster data that describes the nature of the hazard. It might be polygons, it might be a flood depth grid, it might be a burn severity layer. But it's describing the nature of the hazard, right? And then there's the so what. Who was impacted? What infrastructure was impacted? If you take that hazard data and intersect it with foundational geospatial data, that is where information starts to emerge on what the impacts of a hazard were. And then, the now what. NASA doesn't do the now what piece so much, but what we see a lot of our partners in emergency management do is then, take that information or take that analysis and produce information on the number of houses that were damaged, the number of people who might have been impacted, the specific assets or pieces of infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants, power plants, bridges, dams, levees, et cetera, that were in the area that was impacted. And the beautiful thing about remote sensing is that often this information is provided, often this information is provided to supplement reports that are coming out of the field. So the traditional way of collecting this data is to send people out to do field surveys, to do ground surveys. And this doesn't replace that because those are the standard processes that emergency managers use. But this data provides supplemental information to inform decision making. It can help fill in spatial gaps. It can help fill in temporal gaps as well. Okay. So just to kind of provide a few more examples of what these different kinds of data products look like and how we can start to kind of think of categorizing them. Imagery for situational awareness is something that is easily interpreted visually. Behind there is an image, actually I think this one was from Helene, of just Sentinel-2 RGB imagery that you can look at to see where was the flooding. Oh, wow, that was fast, okay. I'll just skip to the examples, actually. The similar, analogously, when we're talking about the what and data describing hazards, right, we can think about flood maps. This is an example from there was some pretty severe flooding in Brazil last year that our team supported, and we provided both optical imagery and also flood extent and depth grids to support US Southcom and the government of Brazil and the State Department. And then when we think about, what are these so what products, we're thinking about things like power outage proxy maps, where we take that nighttime lights data and combine it with census blocks or zip code grids or population data. Damage proxy maps, where we're combining in infrastructure, information on the population affected, and that sort of thing. So just a couple examples. think we've got time. A couple examples of what this looks like. This is the nighttime, so NASA has a program called Black Marble, which takes day-night band data from the VIIRS instruments on SWOMI MPP satellite and the NOAA 20 satellite, and processes that imagery to look at changes in radiance they look at the radiance detected at sensor from one day to the next. So this is an example from the last May in Houston. There were severe power outages that followed, there was a derecho, basically, severe windstorm that caused widespread power outages in the Houston area, which happened to coincide with a heat wave. So you had people without air conditioning in a heat wave, and it was just this confluence of bad circumstances. So we did a power outage analysis like this. Okay. So you can look kind of over time at how the power outage is changing. So this was, the baseline pre-storm, and then after the incident. And you can also see recovery, kind of take place through this data as well. Clouds impact the clarity of this data. That's one of those environmental factors. Sometimes it's really like this, really striking. Sometimes it's not as useful. But this was an example where it was quite illustrative of the extent of damage and the timeline for recovery. Our intern actually did this fabulous analysis looking at how the changes in radiance corresponded with census data. And so we can look at what neighborhoods might have been most severely impacted. This is an example of surface change data that was produced after the Lahaina fire. So NASA we have tools for analyzing both optical imagery and synthetic aperture radar imagery to do change detection. I believe this one is an optical product, actually, although we'll often do this kind of change detection using SAR data. And so you can see where the fire was happening, where it was most severe. And from this kind of data, you can develop damage proxy maps, which shed light on what areas were most impacted. This is another example. So this one is actually a product that we're developing, or a data set that we're developing as a product for detecting severe storm signatures from geostationary satellite data. One of our team members is using GOES satellite data to basically detect cloud formations that indicate severe storms. So they're overtopping clouds and above Anvil, Sirius, okay, never mind, I'm not gonna screw up the acronyms, but basically he's looking at the kinds of storms that produce lightning, thunder, or lightning, hail, and tornadoes. And so we actually just ran, this is from last month, we ran this product during the tornado outbreaks that were happening across the US. And we're looking at, so this is an example of an experimental product that we're working on developing, and looking at how does this satellite data align with the actual ground observations. So we've got observations on the ground and observations from space. How do those data sets line up? And through this kind of analysis, we're building confidence in some of our more experimental products so that we can clearly communicate with emergency managers when it is and isn't appropriate to use tools like this. In this case, this data is available every 5 minutes in real time from space. So this can provide, practically real-time information on where impacts are occurring or may be occurring, to provide that really low latency insight on what communities might have been affected by these kinds of storms. So these are a few examples. These are a few examples that our team has produced. But what I really want to leave you all with is, how do you access this data to do it yourselves? So there are 4 ways to access NASA data. There are more ways that I think I probably don't know about, but the 4 that we talk about frequently are through apps that NASA publishes on our website. Worldview is one of them. Worldview is a platform where you can access the nighttime lights data, optical imagery, lots of other data sets that NASA makes available as a service. Oh, and actually, before I go to firms, and it's really user-friendly. That's the key here. This is great if you want to get a quick look at what data is available. Another example is the firms website that we have. It's the fire incident response management system. And so FIRMS is explicitly publishing data from Landsat, VIIRS, and GOES on hotspot detections. And they've actually got some experimental products that you can access through their website as well. And again, like, these tools are really powerful when you want to get a quick look at what's going on. If you want to do your own analysis, the disasters program, so DRCS, when we activate, we publish all of our data through our portal, as we mentioned. We publish both ArcGIS REST services and WMS services for most of our products. So if you use Esri, that's great. If you use open source, that's great. Many of our products are also available for download as the processed data product for that incident. So when we activate, we have this little red banner that pops up on our portal homepage, and there's a link there that will take you to the incident gallery that we establish for each of those incidents. And so from here, when you click on these cards, they'll take you to the item details page for each product, and from there you can access the REST service or WMS and download. I should also mention that we include quite a bit of metadata in our item details pages. So if you're looking for notes on recommended use for a particular data set, the caveats about that data set, or the credits to whoever the scientists and science teams that produced that data, all of that information is included on the item details pages. You can also reach out to our team if you have questions. Okay, and then finally, NASA has both APIs and a website where you can download data directly. So this is not managed by the disasters program, but for those of you who are more technically savvy, the Global Imagery Browse Services APIs, GIBs, provide a great way to go and access a lot of this data yourself to do your own processing and your own analysis. Similarly, you can download granules from Earth Data, the NASA Earth Data website, to do that analysis yourself. And for those of you who want to learn more about how to use Earth observation data in disaster response, the Applied Remote Sensing Training Program, RSET, has numerous modules that really walk through how to do these analyses. And so, our team, our science teams across the agency have been involved in producing these training modules. Our team regularly taps into them as well. These are a great resource for folks who want to learn more about how to use the wealth of open data that NASA has available to support incident response. And so I hope, this is really what I want to leave you all with is, let's do this, right? The now what is, how do we go and build a stronger community of practice around the use of Earth observation data and around the use of open Earth observation data in disaster response? Because it's the open data, with commercial data and with private data, there's a lot that you can do that's really focused on structure level damage assessments and the nitty-gritty of what happened during an incident. But the open data provides this wealth of information that I think we're really only scratching the surface on. And so my ask to everyone here is to help us with this, help kind of bring this vision into reality. And so with that, I think we maybe have some time for a few questions. Great. Thank you very much.
Hi, can you talk to me about how assets are allocated in emergency response and how that relationship works between FEMA, NASA, NOAA, and especially since FEMA doesn't have authoritative power to redirect assets? How does that relationship work?
When you say assets, what kind of assets are you thinking of?
So like when they request data on a specific emergency, so like they'll put in a request saying, hey, NASA, we need you to provide this imagery that you've been talking about. How does that relationship work, and how have you seen, does it work well? Does it need to get better? How can we improve that relationship? Or talk to me about how you've seen the response between FEMA and providing this information.
Okay. Yes. So I think I'll go to the policy side of this first. The Stafford Act governs how FEMA works and gives FEMA the authority to issue mission assignments to other federal agencies. A mission assignment is basically a contract where FEMA sends money to another agency to do work for them. When a disaster happens, there are two kinds of disaster declarations that can be issued by the president. There are emergency declarations and major disaster declarations. Both of these kinds of disaster declarations are issued by the president at the request of a governor. So the state asks the federal government for assistance. If that assistance is approved, a disaster declaration is authorized, and that declaration basically opens up a funding pathway for FEMA to request other agencies to do stuff. That goes for search and rescue. That goes for the provision of goods and services. It goes for debris removal and highway maintenance and repairs, and it goes for data and information support as well. And so when we think about the way FEMA works with NOAA and USGS, there are things that NOAA and USGS do that are statutorily authorized to those agencies to do all the time. And so that includes, hazardous weather monitoring activities, earthquake monitoring and detection and reporting, right? There are sets of activities that those agencies do all the time because Congress says they have to. And then there are other programs that FEMA will issue a mission assignment for. The USGS high water marks program is one that comes to mind. USGS will go out, they'll send teams into the field to go look at where flooding actually occurred and document that and produce the authoritative data. NASA, the NASA disasters program isn't part of that system. We operate independently. When FEMA or anyone else asks us for support, we make the decision whether to activate or not. Our funding comes through NASA. NASA's an independent agency, and so our funding comes through the Earth Sciences Division because NASA thinks it's important to do this. And so that gives us a little bit of flexibility to support state-level requests without a federal disaster declaration, for example. And however, it also means, right, that the data that we're producing is experimental. It's not authoritative. It means that our team is not operating a 24-hour, 24/7 response center. We operate pretty much on like a normal 9-to-5 work schedule because that's when our scientists are working. And so it means that we operate a little bit differently. I think the last thing I'll say is that it also means that we make the decision whether to activate or not based on not only whether we think that we can coordinate all that satellite stuff I was showing to actually meet the need, but it also means that we're evaluating our team's bandwidth and availability when we decide to activate. So does that answer your question? Okay, you're welcome.
Hi, thank you for that. How do you relate with like the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters or other remote sensing activities that try to do sort of similar things on the global sense?
Yeah, great question. There are 3 organizations that I think operate or do similar kinds of things to what NASA does. There's the International Disasters Charter, which is an international consortium of government agencies and data providers to do this, right, to provide satellite data to emergency managers. There's the European Space Agency Copernicus Emergency Response Program, which in many ways operates very similar to what NASA does, but is Europe-focused. And then there's UNOSAT, which is a UN program operated, I believe it's under UNOCHA, which is their humanitarian assistant. Oh, it's UNITAR, sorry. Okay, thank you. So that, and UNOSAT, generally, their activations tend to focus more on developing countries. Quite frankly, NASA, or the US does not request assistance through the International Charter very often, and states cannot make requests through the International Charter. I don't believe so. I think that has to go through USGS. I could be wrong, but as far as I know, we don't typically activate the charter because we have lots of resources at home. And so I would say we're, right now, because DRCS is so new, that's an area we're still exploring, is how do we operate on the international stage more appropriately and collaborate with these other organizations. I will say there is one really awesome asset which I didn't talk about at all, which is the International Space Station. I think one of the coolest, but I don't know, the data sometimes is useful, sometimes not so much, but we can ask the astronauts on the International Space Station to take pictures for us. And so that is actually one mission that is coordinated with the International Disasters Charter as well. So the ISS is a data provider for the IDC. The rest of the disasters program, again, because we're still in this process of formalizing what even are the data products that we reliably and regularly can provide, and because we're, like I said, not an operational unit, we don't have any formal way that we're working with the charter at this time. But it is something that we talk about frequently. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Katie. Amazing. I love the focus in on the what now, right? That's really where we need to be going forward, and encourage everybody to think about that. You mentioned earlier about the aerial imagery assets. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was something that's become even more important in our work in emergency response, and where NASA is in that, whether you have your own planes or get activation requests for that.
Absolutely. In the last year, we have had 2 aerial missions that supported disasters. That's, I think, more than in the previous 5 years combined. So it's not something that we do very often. But NASA does have a large fleet of aircraft and airborne sensors. It is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and that aeronautics part is a huge part of what what takes place in Earth sciences. And so I'll talk about the 2 assets that we've used this year. The first one was an asset called UAVSAR, it's a synthetic aperture radar instrument that's on a manned aircraft, not a UAV. It has an L-band, it has a couple different SAR instruments, but the L-band instrument is the one that we used during Hurricane Milton. The NASA independently, like our program, decided that we wanted to fund that mission to go fly over Florida for 4 consecutive days to try to see whether we could monitor the rise and fall of riverine flooding after Hurricane Milton. Because it takes, I think somebody was telling me, it takes like 20 days for water to move through the St. James River Basin, which is, I think it might have even been more than that. It's a long time. Basically, because Florida is so flat, water moves really slowly. And so inland flooding is prolonged. So we collected this data to try to monitor that. And as an experimental product, I think it was really interesting, and our science teams are still figuring out how to make better use of that in the future. But that is an asset. UAVSAR, though, is actually regularly requested, or it's regularly used in California to monitor land surface change and landslide movement. So that's an asset that can be available. The other asset that we used during the LA fires is a hyperspectral instrument called AVARIS-3. AVARIS-3 has it has 280, I think, consecutive bands from the near through optical or through visible light spectra. And so it's quite high spectral resolution, and it collects about 2 to 3 meter spatial resolution data depending on altitude. They flew AVARIS-3 over Pasadena, over both the Eaton and Palisades fires, I think 3 times, both while the fires were occurring and after. And we worked with the science teams to try to analyze that data in different ways. I think the most useful product that came out of that was an ash fraction map that provided information to Cal State Guard and other stakeholders on the ground, just to get a sense of where there might have been hazardous debris. both of those, what I'll say is that for both of those assets and all of our aerial assets, it's not like they're just sitting on a shelf. They are often deployed for science missions all over the world. And so we're thinking, right now, we're in our work to try to come up with a product menu. We're thinking about those assets as serendipitous, perhaps, assets that might be available but might not always be available, or might not always be available in the time frame requested. They also typically have a cost associated with them, unless they just happen to be flying for another mission and collect in that area. But NASA has, we're working on inventorying what actually all the capabilities are, but most of our airborne remote sensing assets are hyperspectral of some nature or other, either for sensing atmospheric constituents or sensing on the ground, or a lot of them collect in situ measurements. So they're measuring airspeed, temperature, precipitation, that kind of thing. And so we are working to kind of catalog those as well. Did that answer your question, Yermaya? Okay, great. Is that it? Okay, thank you so much.